This presentation will examine teacher questioning and how we can use it as formative assessment, especially in support of students as they work towards accomplishments in relation towards the Common Core state standards. This presentation is divided into three sections. In the first, we consider how our conceptualization of reading is continually evolving, and as our understanding of reading evolves, how important it is to make sure that reading assessment keeps up with that evolving understanding. We'll then look at the relationship between teacher questioning and student attainment of the Common Core state standards. And we'll finish up with a consideration of how teacher questioning can act as a very powerful and resource-rich form of formative assessment. This slide contains the most recent definition of reading as provided by the National Assessment of Educational Progress in relation to reading. And I've highlighted the third bullet of this definition because I believe it's a sea change in how we think about reading, and it also reflects how the Common Core state standards approach the teaching and learning of reading and how the performance assessments go about assessing it. The third bullet says that reading includes using meaning as appropriate to type of text, purpose, and situation. And this differs from previous definitions of reading because in previous definitions, the establishment or construction of meaning was an endpoint to reading. Here what we see is the idea that reading and constructing meaning or comprehension is actually the middle ground. And it's what we do with the meaning that we construct that is important. And this is especially so with the Common Core state standards. Because a new understanding of reading includes the idea that we read not just to answer comprehension questions, but to use or apply the meaning that we construct through reading, formative assessment takes on an even more important role. That role is one where teachers need to understand, do my students comprehend text, and how are my students doing as they are involved in increasingly complex tasks, especially as they relate to the Common Core state standards. To help illustrate how the Common Core state standards take up on this theme of reading as not only constructing meaning, but using the meaning that's constructed, I'd like to examine a specific standard. This is from informational text, and it deals with the integration of knowledge and ideas. And the standard itself is explain how specific images, such as a diagram showing how a machine works, contribute to and clarify a text. And as we examine this standard and the example that I provide, I'd like to point out that the text is not very complex at all because I want to focus on what students are going to be asked to do in addition to comprehending the text itself. So let's look at this text and task combination. Here's an illustration, a photograph of a whole bunch of bridges, and to the right of that is a very simple, straightforward text about bridges. If we conduct a task analysis of this simple photo and this simple text to see what students have to do to be able to meet the Common Core state standard, we might be surprised with the complexity of thinking and manipulations that students have to do. To demonstrate achievement and to meet this Common Core state standard, the students must do the following. First, students must do what readers always have to do, and that's construct meaning from the text. Second, they have to comprehend the related image, in this case, the photograph of the bridges. Next, they have to compare the two related understandings, and then analyze both the picture and the text to determine the separate and joint contributions that each makes to an understanding. In addition, students will be required, through writing or speaking, to explain how the two comprehended parts relate to one another. And finally, students will have to describe how the image, in this case the photograph, helps in the comprehension of text. Now, I'd like to point out that this standard is actually a second-grade informational text Common Core state standard. Of course, as students progress through middle and then late elementary school and then middle school and high school, the complexity of texts and tasks will increase considerably. When we do a task analysis, sort of deconstruct the Common Core state standard, and imagine the performances that will be demanded by the standard, we get to be we're in a good position to ask about what sort of formative assessment might we use, what sort of teacher questioning will be valuable to help us understand where students are along the path to successful accomplishment and achievement related to the specific Common Core state standard. One of the things that is very promising related to teacher questioning is that as good as our questions are, will be as good as the information we get that helps us understand where students are in terms of their zones of proximal development, and in related issues of what is the best teaching, what is the best curriculum, what is the best instruction to help meet students where they are and to help move them forwards towards these complex performance standards. When we think of the complexity of performances that students will need to partake of and succeed at in relation to the Common Core, we can think about many steps that students must make from the beginning to the end of a school year or school semester. And if each of these steps is conceptualized as a zone of proximal development, then of course our task is to figure out where the first step is and where the next step is in the future. And the best way for us to figure out where these steps towards ultimate attainment of Common Core is through formative assessment. Formative assessment provides information that's going to help us clearly identify individual students' needs and strengths. Now, how formative assessment does this for us is really up to the quality of the formative assessment that we conduct in our classroom on a regular basis. We know that good formative assessment is an ongoing process, and teachers use it to obtain information about students' reading development and their reading achievement. We know that good formative assessment is conducted in the midst of teaching and learning, and we know that the information gathered from formative assessment enables teachers to continually update their understanding of both students' needs and strengths. We also know that good formative assessment can directly inform our teaching and learning, and that it contributes to students' continuous reading growth. Good formative assessment helps shape the nature of our teaching and of students' learning as students move towards more complex performances that are required by the Common Core. In this slide, I try to illustrate the important relationship between formative and summative assessment. If you follow the F1, F2 through F5, what I'm trying to portray here is that good formative assessment is systemic, it's planned, and it's linked to the summative assessments. So if S1, here a summative assessment, is a performance assessment related to the Common Core, then F1 through F5 are assessments that we do regularly in our classroom that help us figure out how students are doing in each of the complicated aspects of learning and reading that they need to be able to do to attain the Common Core state standard. One way that we can think about the potential power of formative assessment is that while accountability is judged with high-stakes summative tests, the accountability is created by our use of formative assessments. We're fortunate to have a considerable research base that helps us identify the characteristics of good questions. And if I'm making a claim that formative assessment is composed in part of good teacher questioning, I think it's important for us to consider the characteristics of such questions. First, good questions reflect expected learning and achievement. They communicate to students precisely what we want them to do, whether it's to respond or perform or both. Good questions are geared to the grain size of a particular educational objective, so we craft our questions, if we're asking a student to define a vocabulary word, in a manner that's appropriate, just as a different question where we're asking students to synthesize 3 stories or 3 texts are going to be looking at a different aspect of the act of reading. Our good questions will always reflect a detailed task analysis of the student work that we are actually requesting through the question. Good questions are comprehensible. We know that a question itself is sort of a mini text, and we want our mini texts to be as understandable as possible for our students. We don't want a question to confuse or confound a student before they even get to the point of the question. Related, we know that our students vary sometimes quite a lot in terms of their individual differences in reading. And we know that as tasks get more complex and texts get more complex, the wait time considerations that we need to make when we ask a question or pose a question are going to be changing. We also need to remember that passage dependence and passage independence relate to whether or not a student can answer a question having read or not read the text. Good questions also respect where the student is in terms of individual development. We don't want to be asking questions that are over the head of particular students, and we don't want to ask questions that are puerile or boring for other students. We want to ask questions that reflect the types of thinking and learning related to reading that we believe are important to model and then require of our student. In this sense, we can use questions as teaching devices. Good questions that teachers ask can become the good questions that students ask of themselves independently. And finally, good questions are clearly related to other classroom and school reading assessments. So if we wanted to map backwards from a Common Core state standard, part of how that would help us is in formulating the different types of reading questions that we ask as students progress towards that Common Core state standard. If we think about the complexity of the Common Core state standards and the performance assessments that lie really at the end of a lot of student learning, I think you'll like the idea of an arc of questions. An arc of questions is something that can help us support students' Common Core achievement from start to finish through formative assessment. And the arc of questions is in relation to the premise that constructing meaning is a midpoint in most acts of reading in school, and that we must determine where students are in terms of understanding the text before we start asking them to do higher order thinking in relation to that understanding. I'd like to illustrate the idea of an arc of questions in relation to a teacher, Joan, and her classroom and students, and also in relation to Bloom's taxonomy. We're going to be seeing a series of formative questions that are asked that take students from literal and low-level inferential understanding to higher order thinking. Here's the scenario. Students are learning about global warming. They're reading articles on the internet, and they're reading a science textbook chapter. Students are required in this unit to engage in higher order thinking, and Joan, their teacher, needs to determine through questioning used as formative assessment what her students currently know and their readiness to go on to the next level. If we look at the first of the 2 questions in this arc of questions, they're probably not earth-shaking. They're very straightforward. They're focused on literal understanding of text. In Bloom's taxonomy category knowledge, we can ask a question, as Joan does: what is one cause of global warming? And to check another lower level type of understanding, Joan asks a question like this: how does global warming occur? Which gets at students' comprehension of text. It's in the next 4 categories of question that we see students required to move to higher order thinking. For example, the 3rd level of Bloom's taxonomy application is asked a question by Joan that goes as follows: what might happen with global warming as the number of automobiles increases? And here the idea is students take their literal and inferential understandings and use that to problem solve. The next 3 levels, actually the final 3 levels in this arc of questions, deal with higher order thinking in relation to analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. When Joan is interested in making sure her students know how to analyze what they've read, she asks a question like this: what proof of global warming is offered by those people who claim it is a potentially deadly problem? As important as this question is the following point: we do not want to ask students higher order thinking questions until we've ascertained that they actually have understood the texts that have been assigned at a literal and lower level inferential level. Once we do that, we can ask analysis, application, synthesis, and evaluation questions. And so the last two questions to illustrate the high end of the arc of questions are these. Joan asks, what would you include in a comprehensive plan to reduce global warming, which in this case allows students to demonstrate that they can synthesize information from across several texts. And evaluation, where Joan's question is, are the alternative explanations for global warming that are given by those who are opposed to taking action against global warming credible, and why? Teacher questioning, when used as formative assessment, informs us about student learning and student progress with increasingly complex texts and tasks. Such formative assessment can inform our instruction in relation to students constructing meaning from text, and then students using that meaning in related tasks. Teacher questioning and formative assessment that focus on text comprehension and task performance are a high priority as we help students prepare and then meet the Common Core state standards. And finally, formative assessment and summative assessment must work together. They must be supported and they must be planned hand in hand so that they end up both contributing to an effective assessment program.